Welcome to our podcast. My name is Keith Stanglin. I'm the director of the Center for Christian Studies. I'm joined today by the Associate Director, Todd Hall, and also by our guest today, Carl Trueman. Carl Trueman is a professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College. He's a fellow in the Ethics and Public Policy Center's Evangelicals in Civic Life program, and he's a contributing editor for First Things. Trueman is the author of the best-selling, award-winning 2020 book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self: Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution, which explores the nature of the sexual revolution against the background of the development of expressive individualism. This book has been described by Rod Dreher, who was writing in the Wall Street Journal, as one of the most important religious books of the decade, and by Ben Shapiro as, quote, the most important book of our moment. And so we're really happy to have you, Carl Trueman, with us today. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here, Keith. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so we had you here for a First Things lecture in Austin, and that went really well, and thought we would have a conversation with you about this book I just mentioned and some other things. First of all, were you surprised at the success and popularity of this book, which does hit on a lot of controversial current day issues, but also is a rather academic book?
Yeah, completely stunned. I had no sense of how it was going to strike a chord with the reading public. It's a 400-page book.
Yeah.
It's not a heavy scholarly book, but it's not a light read either. So yeah, absolutely blown away by the chord that it struck with the reading public.
Yeah, so, and I've mentioned to you in a previous conversation that I first ran into your work probably over 20 years ago. I think it was 2001 when I was in grad school. You had co-edited a volume on Protestant scholasticism, a great book of essays, but very much scholarly, also genre there. Much of the writing in this book from 2020, I would say, is the culmination of a lot of your previous writing in First Things on these issues. And so I am just sort of interested in, because it is quite a change from a book like Protestant scholasticism, and certainly hitting these current day issues in a way those other writings don't. How did you become interested in the topics that you covered in this book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self?
Well, a number of factors or reasons played into it. One, I'd been writing and teaching on the Reformation in the 17th century for 25 years, and there comes a point at which I was starting to get a little bit bored with it, wanting something else to do. Secondly, I was approached pretty much simultaneously by Crossway and by the conservative journalist Rod Dreher. Both approached me and suggested that it would be useful for somebody, i.e. me, to write a little introduction to the work of Philip Rieff, the Freudian sociologist whose work very much informs the book as it was finally written. They wanted, I think, the equivalent for Rieff that James K.A. Smith did for Charles Taylor, a brief introduction to a much more complex thinker. So I started to work on that, and I became convinced that a more interesting project would actually be to apply Rieff to reading modern culture rather than simply expand Rieff. And thirdly, at the time, I was a part-time pastor. I was teaching in a seminary, but was a part-time pastor, and I was intrigued by the way that young people didn't think the way that I did, thought in dramatically different ways, and what was obvious to me was not obvious to them. And these were good faith young people. I'm not casting aspersions on their motivations at all. I was just intrigued at why is it, particularly in the realms of sexual ethics and increasingly matters of gender, that the rising generation thought differently to myself. So really those three factors played into making this an intriguing project for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did it go in directions you didn't expect? When you were doing the sort of research and reading for it, one of the things that is so interesting about the book is that you don't go back to the 60s, and which is difficult. Part of it is, you think, okay, well, how do we address this situation? It's been bad since the 60s, and it's a lot less hopeful than that. It goes back 500 years.
Yeah, I think I became convinced fairly early on, partly through the reading Charles Taylor, that the transgender issue, which was the major focus, or it was originally going to be the focus of the book, trying to find out why the statement "I'm a woman trapped in a man's body" has become plausible to the ordinary man or woman in the street. I became convinced early on that the story can't be told over decades. It has to be told over centuries. That actually transgenderism is one symptom or one function of much broader cultural changes. And so there was that, the broadening of the context, but also the realization that, wow, those of us who oppose transgender ideology are actually complicit in many of the cultural changes that have made this plausible. So the complicity of myself, the complicity of the Christian church, the complicity of Western culture as a whole in this issue was something that emerged over time to me as I was engaged in the study.
Interesting.
I'm surprised by how often people, and here I'm thinking non-specialists, but educated Christians, seem not to know that such deep roots exist at all, and do just sort of think, if there are deep roots to what's happening right now, it goes back to the 1960s, and that's about it, and don't realize all the things that happened before. Of course, you draw out, I think, very interesting connections between Rousseau and Marx, and make a lot of those, and Freud, make a lot of those connections very clear and explicit. But there's a common assumption out there that I've run into that, we've been pretty much blindsided by all of this, and it's just something that's happened in the last 10 years or so.
Yeah.
And I assume maybe that's one reason you wrote this book also, is just to kind of disabuse people of that notion that this has been a very long time coming and might have even been in some ways predictable. But do you see this kind of historical ignorance out there also, or?
Yes, I think people tend to be somewhat mesmerized by the things that are happening before them, for obvious reasons. They're the most real and pressing issues. We tend, on the whole, not to think historically. I mean, you and I are both trained historians, and if I was to point to a point of contact between this work and my earlier work on Protestant scholasticism, that notion that one has to set the Reformation against the background of the Middle Ages, and the continuities, discontinuities, trajectories, developments, that's very important to the work that you and I did on 17th century stuff. That, I think, plays out in all of history. That, conservatives can go back to the 60s and say, well, it's all the fault of the 60s. But of course, the question then becomes, well, where did the 60s come from? The 60s don't emerge from nowhere. Obviously, when you're writing a historical narrative, you have to somewhat arbitrarily decide, I'm going to start here. I'm going to acknowledge there's a backstory, but I'm really going to start here and work forward. But I thought that going back a few hundred years would give people a sufficient grasp on the broad historical context. But most people have not done the reading, have not done the thinking, don't have the time to do these things. That I have the luxury of time to be able to reflect on these things. And I hope the practical payoff of that is that people realize that the solution to this problem is not winning the next election, because the problems are much more deep-seated and deeply grounded. We can't just elect the Messiah in 2022 and expect everything to be put back together. What we're dealing with is a much broader historical set of phenomena.
Yeah.
So you alluded to this earlier, and I should say to everyone listening that we're talking mainly about the book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. A more recent book that you've written called The Strange New World is as I understand it, in some ways, condensing and making it maybe a little more accessible, the same content to readers. I haven't read the second book because I figure, hey, I read the first book, maybe I don't need that one. There may be more to it than that, but there is that other book out there. If in case we scared people off by saying this was a 400-page book, get Strange New World and get maybe the best of all of this. But you begin this book, The Rise and Triumph, with the statement that your grandfather would not have understood someone saying, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. And that does remind me of, at the beginning of A Secular Age, Charles Taylor, and I don't know if you intended an allusion or not, but he says, it's we believe, even believers believe in God very differently than people did 500 years ago, and it was by default, everyone was a believer, and that has shifted now. So his book is an attempt in some ways to answer how that shift has happened, what has changed, where people almost by default entertain atheism now. Well, the question here is what has changed where 2 or 3 generations ago they wouldn't have understood I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, but now that is something that we're all expected not only to understand, but to sort of accept. So I know it's a big question, but sort of summing up your book here, what has changed?
Well, I could give a very long answer to that, but I'll zero in on what I think are the 3 most important things. One, what we've witnessed over the last few hundred years is an increasing authority granted to inner feelings. Mm-hmm. So we've slowly but surely come to think that the people we really are our inner feelings. And physical reality has become less and less authoritative on that front. Secondly, I think in the political realm, we've seen the dramatic triumph of the rights of sexual minorities. So the LGBTQ, I'll leave the T out for a second, the LGBTQ movement has made dramatic inroads and has really come to shape public discourse and the rhetoric of public discourse in a way that strongly favours those that would previously culturally have been regarded as sexually deviant, in a way that has now tilted, I think, the cultural gravity against, for want of a better term, white heterosexual male normativity. So there's that general cultural shift that's taken place that I think the trans movement as a political movement has been able to capitalise on. Because what unites the L, the G, the B, the Q, and the T is a fundamental repudiation of what we call heteronormativity, traditional sexual morality and identity. The third factor, I think, is technology. And what we've seen, my granddad died just under 30 years ago. What we've seen in the last 30 years in a whole variety of areas is what the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa calls social acceleration, where technology has moved so fast that our thinking has been barely able to keep up. And what technology has made more and more plausible is this idea that, hey, you can change your gender. We've seen hormone therapies develop, we've seen surgeries develop that make it imaginable that one could change one's gender. So whereas in the past we had this highly psychologized, expressive, individualist world, it was still somewhat limited because technology had limits that made it implausible to think that one could change from being a man to a woman. That has changed, I think, in the last 20, 30 years. And when it's been picked up by figures in pop culture, such as, I suppose most famously, Bruce, now Caitlyn Jenner, that too serves to increase the public profile and public plausibility. So 3 things: increasing emphasis and authority of feelings, dramatic political wins for the LGBTQ lobby, on which the T has been able to piggyback, and thirdly, transformations in technology that have transformed the way we think about what's possible within the world.
Yeah.
That's really helpful, and it raises a couple of, I think you're right about all that. It sounds exactly right to me. It really reflects, I think, the reality we all see A couple of questions that raises, though. One is, even though I think there is this, I think you put it before, where we used to seek to conform our mind to our body. The body was a reality that we couldn't escape, and if someone said they didn't feel comfortable in their body, we would say that's a problem with your mind or your soul, and so that needs
as in anorexia or bulimia, for example.
Exactly, yeah, sort of a body integrity disorder. Where people think they shouldn't have this or that limb or part of their body. We would say there's a problem there with your mind. Let's fix that. Now there is that inverse kind of wanting to conform our body to our mind or feelings.
Shift of authority there.
Does that sit uncomfortably or strangely with a worldview that's basically materialistic? In other words, I guess I'm asking, does this go back to, I don't know, Descartes in some ways, where there's more of a dichotomy between soul and body? But this is a culture usually that even denies anything besides the body. In other words, when I was growing up, it seemed like it was the secularists, the non-Christians who emphasized the body and accused Christians of denying the reality of the body and all about soul and all that. So does that question make sense?
It does, and I think there's a sense in which often Christianity has failed to give the body its due. It's interesting talking to Christians who think, well, the gospel is all about forgiveness of sins. Of course, the gospel is not only about forgiveness of sins, it's all about resurrection. I say to students in class, if the gospel is just about forgiveness of sins, then I think the death of Christ would be quite sufficient. But Christ rises again, he ascends. There's a bodily element to this. And I love that bit in Thomas Aquinas when he's talking about, in the Summa, what happens when you die. And he says, well, your soul goes to be with God in heaven, but that's not you. It's not truly you until the day of resurrection, when your soul is reunited with matter, and you are embodied. So I think there's a certain legitimate criticism of some popular reception of Christianity. I think there's also a legitimate criticism of Descartes on that front. As I'm not a Descartes expert by any stretch, but it seems to me that Descartes has a problem making sense of the body. The way he sets up his philosophy leads him that the body becomes a problem that he has to wrestle with and ultimately can't give a satisfactory account of. So again, that's legitimate. I would say so, though, that when it comes to materialism, there's an issue there of, it's one thing to be a materialist, but I think the kind of materialism that we witness today, it is materialism, but it's materialism that sees matter as raw material over which we can impose our wills. So it's not as if the materialist says, well, my body is my body and that has an authority and integrity. I think the modern materialist, to the extent that anybody reflects on this, thinks, well, my body is my body, but it's really like a piece of Play-Doh over which I can impose my will. And my body can be made to do what I wish and can be used to realize myself. I mentioned in a lecture the amicus brief in the Dobbs case, the abortion case that led to the overturning of Roe earlier this year, where the female athletes file an amicus brief, professional American female athletes file an amicus brief in opposition to the pro-life proposals. It's a pro-abortion document. What's interesting about that document is the way they talk about their bodies. Their bodies are tools. They write about their bodies as an electrician might talk about a screwdriver, or a carpenter might talk about a circular saw. It's something that they use to realize themselves. It's a tool. And I would say, when we think about materialism, people realize the body is important. That's why trans people want their bodies changed, precisely because this body is important, but they tend to conceptualize it as raw material over which they can impose their wills, and not as having an integrity and a meaning in and of itself.
I wonder if that's a consequence of the materialism, that someone who thinks that one's identity is partly corporeal and embodied, but is also more than that. It's not merely matter. There is a soul. There's something immaterial there. There's something God-given, of course, that unites with the body, is at home in the body, and enriches, exalts, almost divinizes, we might say, the body also, and therefore makes it something that we must treat with respect and dignity. Last night in the lecture, you also, and this is to the point about how the T got in with the LGB, and I think many people have noticed, including many of the LGB folks, have noticed that the T sits uncomfortably in that group. And you mentioned sort of in passing that it would be more at home actually in the transhumanist movement. I had not thought of that before. Thought that was a very good point. Can you talk just maybe for a minute about tell everybody kind of what the transhumanist movement is and how T fits into that? It's trans after all.
Yeah.
So.
Well, the transhumanist movement is somewhat diverse. You can't sort of say transhumanism represents this single idea, but I would say in general, when we talk about transhumanism, we're talking about a movement that sees the limitations of humanity, specifically the physical limitations of humanity, as a challenge, as a problem to be overcome. Most obviously, mortality. There's a strand of transhumanism that's trying to develop a way of living forever, of not dying. The physical body dying is an offense to that kind of transhumanism. And I think what you see in transgenderism is, again, well, what is the sex nature of our body? Well, we could see it as a limitation. And it's something that's, whereas most of us would say the sex nature of my body is actually an integral part of who I am. It's not a problem. It's an integral part of who I am. Transhumanists would say, well, why do you think that way? Does it not place a limitation upon your will? Is it not something to see as a challenge? Is it not something to overcome? It's a sort of quasi-Nietzsche movement in some ways. You know, when Nietzsche presents man is something that must be overcome on the way to the overman. Transhumanism sees that as a technological challenge, that our bodies become something to overcome. And so that's where I think transgenderism, when you think about just in general about the LGBT, there are a number of things that bind the L, the G and the B and possibly the Q together. Well, actually, no, let's leave the Q out. The L, the G and the B, they assume the importance of the sex nature of the human body. So Andrew Sullivan, gay journalist, gets into trouble because he says, I'm not sexually attracted to women who've transitioned to being men. They're not real men. I don't find them sexually attractive. He's assuming the importance of the sexed body at that point. The second thing the L, the G and the B have in common that the T does not necessarily bind to is they're defined by sexual attraction. When you think about the T, it's not actually grounded in sexual attraction. It's grounded, I would say, in discomfort with the body. When I say, to make an evaluative comment, it's grounded in body dysmorphia. What binds it together with the L, the G, and the B is the T is a marginal group. It's marginalized because of white heteronormativity, as the phrase goes, and therefore the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And it's made common cause on that front. There's a footnote in my larger book, I think it's a footnote, where I quote from an interesting exchange I had with Rosaria Butterfield, who was a professor of queer theory at Syracuse University. She's now the homeschooling wife of a Reformed Presbyterian pastor. It's about as dramatic a transformation. Psalms only worship kind of dramatic transformation. And she makes the point there that even in the 80s, when she was involved in the LGBTQ movement, as then was, the T was behind the scenes. There was no real love between the L and the G and the T. They maintained a common front for political and cultural reasons. But I think her phrase is, these are the things we said when the cameras weren't rolling. And they're somewhat revelatory about the internal dynamic of the movement.
It's interesting. I wonder with the T, as you said, the L and the G especially are really sexual developments. But, when it comes to expressive individualism and thinking through things like rapid onset gender dysphoria and that sort of thing, I mean, clearly you've got some people, I think a minority of those who would classify themselves as T, who actually have gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
So much more seems to be sort of performance. So when you talk about the body, I was thinking a lot of people see the body as a canvas, a way to kind of express themselves. I mean, think about the rise of tattoos, things like that, a way to kind of say, this is where I am. I wonder how much of that is connected to our disconnection from each other. I'm thinking about Bowling Alone and just sort of the disintegration of society.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think there are a number of aspects to it. One, I would say it's not unusual for teenagers to have a body dysmorphia of some kind. It's fascinating that rapid onset gender dysphoria disproportionately affects young girls in exactly the same way that bulimia and anorexia 20, 30 years ago disproportionately affected young girls. Young girls hitting puberty, going through puberty, find themselves often very uncomfortable with their bodies. Of course, what we now have is a culture where the only categories we give them to think about that, the only permissible categories are trans categories. So it does not surprise me that a young girl struggling with body image and body, looking around, how do I make sense of this? Well, you're obviously trans, and that's where when that is the strong gravitational pull of the culture, that's very, very persuasive. Secondly, I think the performative aspect is important as well, because it becomes a way of belonging. I was chatting to somebody recently, and they said, almost none of the kids at my school identify as heterosexual. Well, first of all, when I was at school, we wouldn't have identified ourselves in terms of our sexuality anyway. But said because it's not cool to be straight. If you want to belong, you have to be you have to deviate from past norms. That's the way to belong. And I think teenage kids want to belong. Nobody wants to be the odd kid out. It's why they all dress the same. So again, I think the trans issue plays that on the crumbling of society. Two things there. One, I think the role of the internet fuels this in various ways. Not least, it makes us imagine that we can be anything we want to be. You can perform in any way you wish on the internet. And finally, I think the collapse of the category of friendship is very striking. Again, chatting to a youth worker in the last 12 months, and he said, 80% of the girls at the high school where I work identify as bi or lesbian. And I said, why do you think that is? And he said, it's because we have not taught them what friendship is. They have strong feelings for people of the same sex, and the only categories we now give them are LGB categories. Keith, one of my loves is Cardinal Newman. I got a sort of guilty pleasure as a Protestant reading Newman. If you read Newman's letters say to his friend Ambrose St. John, from a modern perspective, they can sound homoerotic because the strong feelings and emotions that Victorian Englishmen used in their private letters to express their feelings for each other, we read them now through the lens of homosexuality. Actually, at the time, it was simply the idiomatic way of expressing a close friendship. And I think we've lost that category of friendship. So the general malaise in society, I think, plays strongly to this kind of ideology being very, very plausible.
I remember Anthony Eslin had an article in Touchstone years ago arguing that the rise of acceptance of gay relationships killed friendship.
Right.
And I think he analyzed maybe Frodo and Sam And shortly thereafter, I remember reading discussions about how Frodo was gay. You know, and you can't look at relationships.
Bert and Ernie on Sesame Street.
That's right.
You know,
That's
David
the
and
thing.
Jonathan,
Yeah.
Hebrew scholars,
Yeah.
have done the same thing.
Yeah.
With them.
Yeah.
My daughter, she's married and everything's good, but she went through that little. She didn't have dysmorphia or anything like that, but anime plays a big role in that.
Interesting.
And so I think it's important for parents. Parents, if you're listening, don't let them watch anime. It's very confusing for them. But also, it's funny. All of her friends, before she got married, would have these conversations, and they have this huge spectrum of sexuality. And the first question that they ask is, well, where are you on this spectrum? You know, and it's not just LGB, you know. And Maddie said, well, you know, I'm saving myself for marriage, and I want to get married and be a mom. And they said, oh, well, you're this. I can't remember what it was, but it was some label for, you know, normal.
One category among 80 or something.
For people who want to do what humans have always done, you know. Interesting. So, and I think it is just, I keep thinking it's just got to be a place to belong. I wonder, too, how much of it relates to the sexual pressure on young girls. They are, you know, the way they're depicted in media and commercials and everything makes sexuality kind of central. And I just don't think that is the case, especially for girls. And there's so much pressure that they can kind of relieve that pressure by suggesting, well, I'm lesbian or whatever else.
Yeah, that's possible. That's possible. I think that one of the things is we're at a stage at the moment where a lot of theories are plausible. The evidence is anecdotal. I expect in the next 5 or 10 years we'll start to get some good, solid studies emerging that will probably confirm many of these theories.
I wonder if the Academy will actually do study of this. It kind of makes me a little nervous.
Mark Regnerus at the University of Texas is our hope at this point.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
And this relates a lot of this to what's called expressive individualism. You talk a lot about that in your book. What exactly is expressive individualism, and how do we see that?
Yeah. Good question. It's a term, I think, coined by Robert Bellah, sociologist in the 1980s, in his very interesting book he co-authored with a number of others, Habits of the Heart, where he's looking at what the normative understanding of being a person is among Americans at that time. And he coins this term to refer to a way of understanding yourself that sees you, you know, you see yourself as primarily feelings, inner feelings, and therefore your authenticity is discovered by being able to act outwardly on those feelings. The example I use, it's an extreme example, but that brings this rather dramatically to the fore, is the interview that Diane Sawyer did with then Bruce, now Caitlyn Jenner. In 2015. You can find it online. I think it was for 60 Minutes. Jenner's language about the transition is very much, finally I'm able to be the person I always have been. Well, what's Jenner saying there? Saying, you know, at last I'm able to live outwardly in what I felt inwardly. Now that's an extreme case, but most of us actually think in those kind of terms. And it's not all bad. Expressive individualism is not all bad. We have words for people who aren't outwardly what they are inwardly, you know, hypocrite, two-faced, etc., etc. On the other hand, we've also understood typically that reserve, self-control, the denial of inner feelings is also an important part of being a member of a cogent and coherent society. So when expressive individualism starts to run amok, we can find institutions get transformed. As I said in my lecture last night, they cease to be places of formation and become platforms for performance. And when institutions become platforms for performance, then the very glue that holds society together starts to weaken, and we enter a very interesting phase of history.
Mm-hmm.
So you've worked with churches, you're a pastor. What do you tell members, and particularly parents, about all this? How do we help parents in this highly charged environment? So sort of the practical question here. How do we help people understand the situation and what to do?
Number of things. One, I think be aware of the problems. My book's not the only thing you could read on this, but I think be aware of the problems. Be aware that young people growing up today do not think like their parents do, and it's not the typical generation gap. It's not typical teenage rebellion. There is a major paradigm shift taking place in the way that young people understand themselves. Secondly, understand the role of technology in this. I think the old days where the most influential people in your life were the people you actually had physical contact with, parents, teachers, friends at school. That's no longer the case. The smartphone has revolutionized channels of authority and influence in young people's lives. Thirdly, I think, don't be over-judgmental about young people. I get annoyed at the constant references to snowflakes. I think the world is a much less stable place in terms of the understanding of identity now than it was when I was growing up 40 years ago. So realize that your children are living in an environment where knowing who they are is actually far more difficult than it was. I mean, I say to my kids at Grove, when I was at school, the only people whose opinion really mattered to me among my peers were the 6 or 7 guys that I actually had physical contact with at school day by day. Now, it's the countless thousands who are friends on Facebook, Twitter, etc., etc., many of whom can take pot shots at you with no cost to themselves. Somebody insults you to your face at school, they're going to get punched in the face. There's a cost involved. Today, insults, denigration comes very, very cheap. So be aware that your children live in a very, very difficult world. And I would say, make sure, one, they're in church regularly on a Sunday. Make them part of a church community. Show them with the way you live your life that church is very important. So make sure you're there every Sunday. Don't go to a ball game on a Sunday instead of church, because then you're telling your kids ball games are more important than church. Get your kids grounded in a church community, and if you can, don't give them a smartphone. I know that's hard. There are these things that can give you all that you need from a smartphone without giving you all the stuff you don't need from a smartphone. So think carefully about the access you give your kids to technology.
So we were just talking about Mircea Eliade and how he says some of the same things that Charles Taylor and maybe Robert Pella also say later on. But he contrasts kind of the linear history of modern man with the cyclical history of pre-Christian paganism. And I think Judaism and Christianity do sort of lose some of that cyclical history, but they still have a pretty definite liturgical calendar, which in that sense there's a cyclical nature to it. So it doesn't totally do away with just living now and in the moment, and nothing before. We have nothing to do with what came before us, whereas Eliade argues that every time that a people, a culture, a religious faith community participates in these feasts or the liturgical calendar, they are participating in a lot of these ideas kind of permeated biblical studies too, and so it's sort of standard fare among
Taylor makes a similar case in
about
time in secular age.
So I was just saying I like Eliade better than Taylor simply because his books are about a tenth of the length.
Better edited.
Or a fifth or something like that.
Taylor's read too much Hegel in German, I think. He comes through into his English prose style.
I got Taylor ambitiously on audiobook because I used to drive, an hour and 15, 20 minutes a day. Yeah. I got about 45 minutes into it and realized I can't keep up with this. Right. It's just too much.
Yeah, you need to be able to read it and go back and read paragraphs. It's not a... It's because it's a kind of circumlocutory argument.
I noted earlier that you're a professor at Grove City College. I also have it on good authority that you're a sitting and voting member of the Animal Welfare committee.
I am. I sit on the
Tell
animal.
us about that.
Well, I can't because we've never met. In the years that I've sat, it's the perfect committee to be on because it doesn't actually seem to exist anywhere than on the committee list that comes out at the beginning of each year. So, I mean, if we do ever meet, I will certainly move that we euthanize all cats on campus. I'm not a cat guy, but maybe that's why we won't meet, because the cat lobby are preventing us from meeting lest I bring that motion.
I noticed earlier that when my cat came in, that it rubbed up against your legs, you just sort of looked at it.
Yeah,
Yes.
If I'd had a gun, I'd have been moving for my gun at that point.
What
but,
would that cat look like euthanized?
It's okay.
I'm convinced that cats did not exist before the fall. They're actually dogs infected by sin in some way. That's
All right. Okay. Cat podcast.
No.
Yeah. Well, that's all right. That's all right.
I tend to agree.
So I know I'm in the minority here, but cats are cool. I think I like their independence and their they don't need that affirmation that certain AV guys I know.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And dogs.
Yeah.
Dogs have people. Cats have staff.
Yes. Was it you that was telling me the joke about if a person brings the
the
dog?
difference between a dog and a cat?
Yeah.
A dog says, "Oh, this person feeds me and cares for me and loves me and houses me. They must be God." And a cat says, "Oh, this person feeds me and houses me and cares for me. I must be God."
One of the differences, yes. So you get the benefit of being on a committee and having that.
Without actually having to attend the committee, it's great. Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah.
So in the previous lecture that we just came from, I was heartened to hear a discussion of music, but to hear both Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd being mentioned in a lecture, which I did not anticipate. So,
in a positive context.
Yes, both mentioned positively, and so
I was not encouraging young people to go home and smash their
That's right.
Pink Floyd, and
or delete them from their playlist on Spotify.
Right,
Whatever would be the modern equivalent, I suppose.
Yes. So, when I asked you yesterday what your favorite Zeppelin album is, and you said
Physical Graffiti.
Yes, my respect for you went up quite a bit, and balanced out what you said about the cats. So, that's good. What about Electric Light Orchestra?
Some of this stuff's good. I would put them in the guilty pleasure category. I have a couple of guilty pleasures, some ELO stuff. Meatloaf would be another of my guilty pleasures. I like...
Do you want me to turn this off now? Or?
No, I've already been outed as a Meatloaf guy. So the over-the-top histrionics of the best of Meatloaf always appealed to me as a kid.
Did you know that Meatloaf was a member of the Church of Christ?
I did not know that.
I did not know that.
You didn't
Wow.
know
No.
Wow.
I know Weird Al is.
He is Weird Al.
But
Faithful, yeah.
still very.
The OPC doesn't have...
You don't have any celebrities?
We don't have any cultural celebrities.
Oh, yeah. Church of Christ is full of them. So, Pink Floyd this was mentioned in the context of concept albums and how Spotify has, and other modern technologies, recent technologies have kind of killed sitting down and listening to an album start to finish and getting kind of a story there.
Mm-hmm.
And Dark Side of the Moon, I think, is great for that. And
The Wall.
The Wall, of course, that one's huge. What's the 1975 right after Dark Side of the Moon?
Wish You Were Here?
Yes.
Is it Wish
Is
You Were
that the
Here?
name of the album also? Yeah,
this is an album, Wish You Were Here, yeah.
And that song's in there, but it starts and ends with Shine On You Crazy Diamond.
Yes.
About 25 minutes worth.
Very self-indulgent prog rock.
Yeah, that's right.
I would give Jethro Tull the edge over Pink Floyd in the prog rock front.
Okay.
And they didn't produce songs that were quite as long and demanding, as to be said.
You can actually listen through them.
So
and they had the flute.
They did. Ian Anderson. My mum used to shop at the same supermarket as Ian Anderson and his wife. She would occasionally see Ian Anderson in the supermarket in Gloucestershire. So my mum having no idea how cool
That was.
that was, of course. But,
The guy at the grocery store.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So I want to return just to the ELO for a bit. I'm a little sad that you put them in the same. That you put ELO in the what was it? The
Guilty
same
pleasure.
category as
As
Meatloaf.
Meatloaf.
Guilty pleasure.
Yeah.
Yes. No, I think it's a great innocent pleasure.
Yeah.
ELO.
yeah, they're a good band.
Their album Time. I don't know if it's not one of their better known ones.
Okay,
And it's
don't
really
know.
the last
Yeah.
good one. And just before they kind of broke up and it was over. But I would highly recommend that album.
Okay, I'll check that
being very, it's a concept, and it's about a guy who travels from 1981 to the year 2095, and part of it is sort of it's a critique of technology
Interesting.
and just how horrible things have become in 2095. There's a song about a robot who meets all of his needs and all of his wants and desires and how terrible it is, and he misses his actual human lover from 1981 and wishes he could go back. He's in a place now where it's just lonely and
It's like an episode of The Twilight Zone. That sort of
that's
idea,
right.
thought experiment. Yeah.
There's this sort of, it's just a technocracy.
Yeah.
And it's terrible.
Yeah.
And
Well, we're getting there. We'll probably get there before 2095.
yeah, that's right. So yeah, it's very timely, and just whether it's that or it's reading Brave New World or 1984, I just get a kick out of these artists, whether they're writers or musicians, still writer, they're composing these words, who foresee, it seems like, so
These
much.
dystopian visions.
Yeah, and kind of seeing where they were right and maybe where they got it wrong.
Yeah.
But the dystopian predictions I think are really interesting, and that one to me is one of the best in kind of the rock genre.
Interesting. An early cellist with ELO was an alumnus of my school back in the UK.
Really?
Yeah. I can't remember his name. But in the early 70s, one of their cellists, if they had more than one.
Probably just one. It was a light orchestra.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And it's an alumnus. He was an alumnus of my school.
Okay.
Wow.
So all these connections.
Yeah.
Who did you know from Zeppelin?
That's right.
You shocked with John Paul Jones? Or, Great. Well, we've talked a little bit about Philip Reef and Charles Taylor. Also, Alistair McIntyre is someone that you interact with a lot in your book, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It seems to me, just from listening to you and from reading the book, that Reef, of the three, Reef was probably the more direct or substantive influence of the three. Is that correct?
I think so. I think Reef is the man who zeroes in on the sexual revolution as being key to modern culture. So and Reef also provides certain interesting categories or concepts for helping to understand how modern culture has developed the way it is. So his concept of the death work, where essentially artists use the symbols and the idioms of a previous time to subvert the values of that time. Andres Serrano's famous or infamous piece of work, Pierce Christ, which is a crucifix submersion in the artist's own urine, is a great example. Reef uses that to point to how something sacred has been made into something profane. It's been made ridiculous. I think his phrase is, the sacramental has been made excremental. It's a great phrase that captures something of how modern culture operates to destroy that which is a previous generation thought was sacred. And when you think about so much of what goes on in society today, not least our attitudes to sex, sex has traditionally been regarded as sacred by Western societies. It's why we surround it with sacred rituals and rites of passage. Now it's become recreation, and that's not simply a natural development, it's a desecration of that which was once sacred.
In all society, all cultures, to prehistory have sacralized sex.
Yeah.
And we're doing something by desacralizing
Yeah.
it that is not just out of step with Christian history, but with human history. And there will be repercussions, it seems.
Yeah. I mean, I think Brief, what I particularly appreciate about Brief on that front is his development of Freud's notion that sexual codes are key to what cultures and civilizations are, that it's what you forbid sexually that lies at the heart of what you hold most valuable. And the fact that we have, I say this to students, when a society doesn't just modify its sexual codes but completely overthrows the sexual codes of previous generations, something potentially very destabilizing is happening in culture at that point. I think Freud and Reef after him are correct.
So, of these three, I've read Taylor and a good bit of McIntyre also, but never have read Reef. Would the one book be The Triumph of the Therapeutic, sort of the best to get a lot of this?
Sort of. I think there are two books that I would go to. One would be Triumph of the Therapeutic, which is his 1966 book, analysing it's really uses of therapy after God has gone. He's looking at what do human beings do to fill the void left by God after God has been dismissed by society. And that's very important, I think, for understanding so much of the dynamic of culture. The other volume I would suggest is the last book that was published in his lifetime. In fact, I don't know if it was published in his lifetime or merely written by him and published posthumously, from 2006, which is My Life Among the Death Works, which is the first volume of a trilogy. The second two volumes of which were definitely published posthumously. And My Life Among the Death Works is an attempt to analyse the mechanisms of culture whereby the therapeutic society has developed and been enforced effectively.
Was Reef a believer? Was he a Christian believer?
He's an interesting character. He's one of those odd guys, and much of Roger Scruton, the English conservative philosopher, tilts this way, though I know there are some who would argue that Scruton was a Christian. My read on Scruton, my implicit read of Scruton and my explicit read of Reef is they don't believe in God, but they think he's a great idea for holding society together and for maintaining a notion of the sacred that they see is morally and culturally very important. So Reef was ethnically Jewish. His religious background was he was a non-observant Jew, essentially. But he laments the fact that society has abandoned belief in God because the loss of what he would call sacred order, the loss of any sense of the transcendent, has meant that society has no basis upon which to organise itself in terms of its moral structure. And therefore, modern society has to justify itself on the basis of itself. And that is an inherently unstable position for modern society to be in. So it's rather odd that, no, he doesn't believe in God, it seems, but he thinks God's an important idea for people to believe in in order to provide structure and moral meaning to the universe.
Yeah. Well, because that was my next question. If the answer is no, then what about how functional and practical and good this is for society and for people? So it's interesting, those guys in that position.
Yeah, although, I mean, can you really even make that distinction? I think Dallas Willard talks about this in The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge, but, once you've taken God out of, so the founders, you go back to Jefferson, and I know conservatives are very big on Jefferson, but here is, sort of the tip of the spear of sort of Enlightenment thinking on that kind of stuff, and he wants to get rid of all of the supernatural and all that stuff, but we're going to keep the ethic because that's very important. But you can't. It's inevitable, because what matters if something is transcendent is not that you believe it to be, but that it is.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really problematic. That way too.
You mentioned something sort of in passing. I almost feel like I recall it being a footnote toward the end of The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self that you make about what will stop the transgender
Right.
movement, and particularly this manipulation of physical bodies. And you said it will be lawsuits down the line of people who have been the object of these experiments, who will sue ultimately, I guess, or most proximately, the people who actually did this, but maybe parents, in addition to medical workers. And I noticed that recently, I think I heard this on the news, that Tavistock in England, in the UK, which stopped, it is I think has been the main provider of this sort of transgender surgery and medical procedures and the puberty blockers and everything, has maybe stopped doing those because of how detrimental it's been.
It's going to be closed down.
Really?
Lawsuits have been piling up.
Yeah.
So we're starting to see that, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. What we're going to see, probably in the United States, at some point will be a class action lawsuit. And I think once the insurance companies lose a class action lawsuit, we will see a dramatic shift in attitudes to this. The tragedy is that will only happen after an awful lot of lives have been destroyed. I think we shouldn't be greeting that scenario with joy on the grounds that people's lives are going to have to be destroyed to get there. But I think that is probably the most likely scenario for the end of this. Though there are others as well. It's the thing about the trans issue, unlike the gay marriage issue, is there's a sense in which, the gay marriage issue doesn't particularly necessarily affect me. If I live next door to a couple of married gay neighbours and they don't party late at night, they mow their lawn, they're polite, it doesn't infringe upon my life. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg, to quote Jefferson. The trans movement it hits women's sports, it hits notions of privacy, it hits parental rights. With
pronouns.
With the pronouns issue, it hits the workplace. The trans issue, it's taking on traditional feminism. The trans issue isn't just fighting a two-front war, it's fighting a multi-front war. And I think it can't possibly win in the long run. Now, that's not to say it's going to lose by next Wednesday or even lose within a decade. But I think in the long run, it's fighting an awful lot of other vested interests. And also, I would say, ultimately, it's fighting against nature. And nature does bite back. And we will see, I think in 100 years from now, people will look back on this particular moment in time with horror. They will look back on the way we look back on lobotomies in the early 20th century and ask, what on earth? Those people were well-meaning, but what on earth were they thinking about? Why did they inflict such suffering on such vulnerable people? I think that is how we will look at the trans issue. And all of those who are glorying in it at the moment will, I think, ultimately appear as monsters in the grand narrative of Western civilization.
I hope so, that will be the case, that people will look back on that.
There's no guarantee, but I think that's more likely than the alternative, but who knows?
I wonder if, I'm just curious about this next question. Have you, in taking these positions and going public with them in your writings and in podcasts, have you taken any hit from, let's say, friends or colleagues, maybe people in the scholarly guild? You don't have to name names or anything, but I'm just wondering, like, have you lost friends over this, or acquaintances, gotten a kind of, I don't know, really negative pushback from, I know you get it from anonymous people. People can say, whoever, that doesn't know you, but people who know you. And
I have not. I have not thus far. I mean, it's possible. I've become aware that invitations given to me to speak in certain places have started to become controversial. As yet, I mean, I was briefly cancelled by YouTube for like 2 minutes or something when I was giving a live lecture once. I've become aware, people have said to me, in advance, be aware there could be a protest, or there could be people walking out. I've become aware that I'm starting to become, I won't say kryptonite, but certainly I'm having conversations with people who've invited me to speak that I never had when I was going in to speak about John Owen or 17th century Reformed Orthodox.
Right.
But I've not lost, as far as I know, friends at this particular point. I think I'm not high profile enough. I don't do Twitter, so I don't provide easy sound bites that allow me to be demonized. I mean, and I'm a likable guy. What is there not to like, man?
Yes.
You know, I'm a hard guy to dislike. So,
even after what you said about cats, I still like you.
no, so I've not lost friends that I'm aware of.
That's right. So you said you've had conversations that you didn't have previously going into lectures?
Yeah, I've had people say to me, be aware, your invitation is controversial. Be aware how you express yourself, because the people who run the show have seen you on the Matt Walsh What Is a Woman documentary, and they're worried that you might be sending the wrong... I was on the Matt Walsh documentary, actually, towards the end. That was an interesting experience as a whole. But I've had those sort of conversations. And I've also oddly started to have the conversation with some people. When I have conversations like that, I'm saying, okay, you do have security in place, don't you? Wow. Yeah, I've begun to say, okay, if you think there's a problem, then you need to make sure there's somebody there that can deal potentially with the problem if it gets out of hand. So for the first time ever the other week, I went to speak at a place, and the security guy showed me the route he was going to use to get me out of the building if it all went down the wrong way. And it was nothing happened. It was great, but wow, this is not the place that a guy who cut his teeth writing on William Tyndale and John Owen necessarily expects to be.
Can I ask the flip side of that? Early on in the book, I think in the introduction, in fact, you say, what you're trying to do is present something that somebody from the other side could read and say, okay, I don't agree with you, but you nailed it. Have you had any interaction with people like that? I'm just wondering if dialogue's even possible.
I mean, there are students at Grove City College for whom these are live issues in their personal struggles, and I've had conversations with a number of them, and I've been gratified that nothing I wrote in the book has prevented me having those conversations. Right. Now, if you're an activist determined to be offended by anybody who raises a question about the absoluteness of your identity, you're not going to like what I say. Yeah. But if you're somebody who's open to talking with another human being about something you may both seriously disagree over, but where there can be a mutual respect between human beings, then I think the book has not created problems for me. Okay. And that was partly how when I wrote it, I was already in situ at Grove when I was writing the book, and I was thinking, these are 18 to 22-year-olds. If they're not struggling with this themselves, they've got friends for whom this is a live issue. That's right. And I want to write a book that fair-minded people will say, okay, I disagree with Trueman, but he didn't write in a way that was denigrating or that said we were subhuman in some way or something like that. I tried to write with maybe a pastoral tone, might not be quite the right way of putting it, but a relatively objective tone, saying, okay, this is how we get here. How we respond, that's another issue. But this is how we got here. And these questions are genuine questions, often asked in good faith by good faith people. Yeah.
I thought that part was particularly well done in the book. The whole book is well done and a great service to humanity and to the church. But the sort of objective laying out of the history, it's hard to take issue with it. It's not necessarily exhaustive in how this it could have been written in different ways. But I think that I see the training and long experience in good objective description. Yeah. Well, you and I mean, you formally and me informally were both mentored by Richard Muller. Right. Who really taught us both that you don't study 16th and 17th century in terms of goodies and baddies. You study them in terms of intellectual genealogy and formation. Exactly. And I think I call that, the way I refer to it to my students, it's critical history. Yeah. It's history that comes in asking certain questions, but setting aside the immediate good, bad, true or false question. In order to get it, okay, what's the dynamic driving this? What are the factors shaping this? Yeah, in our research papers and projects, we he was not supposed to know what we thought about.
Right.
Personally thought about what it was we were describing.
Yeah.
And so actually in some of my earlier publications, I had some people thinking, I guess because I studied under Muller, that I was a Calvinist.
Right.
And I could describe either a Reformed theologian or Arminius in a way that people didn't know. I always took that as a high compliment. So I've got the description maybe right.
Yeah.
They can't tell.
Well, I remember my doctoral supervisor, Peter Stevens, the Zwingli scholar, handing back my first paper to me and saying, I know you don't like these guys. I know you think they're the bad guys. Set that aside. Just tell me what they thought and why they thought it. And that was that moment for me was a kind of, okay. And I remember asking him, he was a highly sacramental Methodist, and asking Peter one day, why do you write on Zwingli when you must despise Zwingli's sacramentarianism? And Peter's response was, because I know if I can write about Zwingli fairly, I'm a good historian and I've done my job. And that really stuck in me, and that prepared the ground for me for the reception of Richard Muller's work. It was okay.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's good. So last question here, but why I think the main question here is, why didn't you sit back and let someone else do this? Why does it fall to you to discuss transgender, Protestant scholastic historian, to discuss this? And I'm thinking of something I heard Rob Gagnon say, who's a New Testament scholar, but ends up writing a lot about kind of same-sex relationships, particularly in the New Testament world. I think he referred to an old episode of Laurel and Hardy, where they're all standing in a line in military service, and the sergeant says, "Who wants to volunteer for X?" Some really terrible thing, and everyone else steps back. Except for Laurel and Hardy.
I've seen that very movie.
Well, I guess you volunteered, and he says he kind of feels that way. It's like no one else was stepping up, everyone else stepped back, and so you're kind of the one left who didn't say no fast enough. So,
it's a number of reasons. I mean, one, it sort of fell into my lap when transgender bathroom policy and sports policy became an issue in the local school district where I was in Philly. My kids had graduated from the local schools, but I was asked by a Catholic friend actually to front a letter to the school board on that issue. So that drew to my attention, and then I think I became increasingly aware that I've been very fortunate, particularly in the last few years, working at a place like Grove City College. I can speak up on these issues with relatively little professional risk, because Grove is a conservative college, and Grove stands pretty foursquare where I stand on these issues. A lot of people don't have that luxury, and I became convinced that if those of us who have the potential of a relatively cost-free stand don't take a stand, why should those who face significant personal and professional consequences take a stand? It's a number of people say to me wherever I go, say, we thank you for your courageous stand. And my response has always been, I'm not actually aware of being that courageous. Yeah, crazy people have a go at me on Twitter, but they're powerless. They can't take my salary away from me. They can't destroy me. I'm not putting anything on the line in the way that others might have to put something on the line. So I don't consider my stand to be courageous. I consider it to be appropriate given the position that the Lord has placed me in. That, okay, you can do this and get away with it. Others can't, so do it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. But at the same time, there's still so many others in similar positions who I think agree are on the same side of this issue that still take the step back. And I'm just curious, because I've thought about this in my own life. Is there something in my DNA, whether it's nature or nurture, where I could have seen, because I feel like I want to take a stand as well. My books haven't been quite as popular as yours, but it's is there something in your own background or DNA kind of has made you think, well, I didn't mind being on the outside of some of these issues early on.
I've never, for looking back to school days, I was never somebody who cared particularly to be cool or in the in crowd. I didn't need the affirmation of others so much. So maybe, as a Calvinist, I could say I would maybe providentially prepared for this. Yeah. But I get people will send me tweets and say, what do you think of this? Are you going to respond? And it's a sort of, no, some idiot on Twitter. I'm going to respond to them. I don't care what they think. I care what my wife thinks. I care what my kids think. And I care what half a dozen friends think. Mm-hmm. Something, again, I learned from Richard Muller. Richard Muller told me early in my career, he said, choose the 6 or 7 academic guys that you really trust. And if they praise you, take it seriously. If they criticize you, take it seriously. Everybody else, whether they praise you or criticize you, ignore them. And I've sort of extrapolated that to my other work and say, okay, there are a handful of people whose opinion I really trust. Other people may be right or wrong, but I don't know them to trust them. Right. So I've got, in my mind, I've got a handful of people that I rely on to tell me, yep, you're on the right track. No, you're on the wrong track. Yeah. And that, I think, is very important. And I don't do social media because it would be so utterly paralyzing. Mm-hmm.
I agree. Well, I'm very appreciative of a conversation that has gone from Led Zeppelin to Richard Muller. So it can't go wrong with that. Yeah. And thank you again, Carl, for joining us for this conversation. Again, the book is The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And the newer, more condensed version of that I would highly recommend to our listeners is Strange New World. Thank you, Carl.
Thanks for having me on.